Welcome to the latest edition of Superpowered the Show. I'm Regina Joseph.
And I'm Nick Hare.
And together we're going to bring you the latest in forecasting trends in geopolitics, energy, technology, and anything else that strikes our fancy. So today we're doing a very special episode on Canada. And Canada has got lots of wonderful things. It's got beautiful forests and coastlines. It's got delicious maple syrup. Can't forget the Mounties, they're pretty special. So why do we think a Canadian election is a pivotal geopolitical data point? Well, in a word, the answer is oil. Canada's got oil like New York has got lawyers, which means a hell of a lot. In fact, Canada contains the third largest proven reserves of crude oil in the world after Saudi Arabia. And for those of you who are interested, Venezuela is number one. Oil is partly the reason why the current Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, has been one of Canada's longest serving politicians ever. A few weeks ago, he called for a new Canadian election, and summer being an unusual time to rev the Canadian electoral engine, as most Canadians will be trying to enjoy what's left of their fairly short summer, swimming and fishing in their gorgeous, amazing lakes. But he's in trouble, and Canada's economy faces some really heavy headwinds. The collapses in oil prices, which are wavering currently in the $30 to $40 range, and it's severely depressed Canada's energy industry, which is based in Mr. Harper's adopted home province of Alberta, Canada. Harper's been extremely protective of the Canadian oil industry, and he's bent over backwards to provide it certain concessions, to the point of enraging environmentalists, native tribes, and ordinary Canadians who feel squeezed by the misspending they claim has been done to preserve it. And now that the world has an oil production glut, with even more oil due to hit the marketplace once Iran supplies come on stream, Canada and Harper are feeling it right in the gut. And despite a corresponding drop in the value of the Canadian dollar, there hasn't been a hoped-for jump in Canadian exports to counteract that. So Canada's problem has ramifications elsewhere. In the Western Hemisphere, the Keystone XL pipeline, which would bring Canadian crude oil down through the length of the U.S.'s most important environmental terrain to refineries in Louisiana and Texas, it's been a political time bomb for both Obama as well as the presidential candidates that are all debating each other right now. Nobody wants to say no to the U.S.'s northern friend Canada by refusing to allow the pipeline, but nobody's wanted to say yes either, especially as the environmental dangers and the dropping oil price threaten its viability. Elsewhere in the Americas, the top oil exporting nations of Venezuela, Brazil, and Mexico, they're all feeling the pain of the oil glut, as well as their own internal political dramas and unrest. Any decision that affects Canadian oil exports will affect them too. And a sea change in Canadian politics, and thus potentially the energy markets, will be felt beyond this hemisphere. For example, China has been quietly waiting on word of whether or not Canada will give up on its southern friend, the U.S., to make the Keystone XL pipeline happen. And thus, if that weren't to happen, Canada will bring that Alberta oil to its Pacific coasts, where Chinese ships will be waiting to bring that oil home. So this election is ultimately a referendum about who will bolster the faltering economy of Canada as the world shudders through long-term geopolitical instability. A new government could send major ripples through the global energy markets, which can exacerbate that geopolitical instability. So, Nick, what does the election picture look like domestically, and what's our forecasting question on this?
Well, I think my knowledge of Canada has gone up by a factor of about 10 after that, because I knew very little about Canada. I'd never even heard of Stephen Harper, and I think he's been the Prime Minister for like 9 years or something. So I'm coming to this from a position of complete ignorance. But the good thing about elections is we know that they're unpredictable. You know, that all we have to go on really is what people say they're going to do, and a lot of people don't know what they're going to do the day that they get into the ballot box. So looking at the poll data, it's quite interesting. It's sort of got closer as the election has gone on. The Conservatives, which Stephen Harper apparently is one of, they've had a slight drop off in support in the last few months, and the polls are, I think, from what I can see, almost 50-50 between them and the NDP. So that's the polls. They don't really get us anywhere. the next question is, well, are there reasons to think that the poll data is skewed? Are people going on the day of the election to be swayed by something else? And I looked at two factors really. Firstly, that Stephen Harper's government is now 10 years old, and governments have a natural lifespan, and it's not since the 1950s that a Canadian government has lasted longer than that period of time. And so I think there's a sense in which it's possible that people might get to the ballot box and have this sort of subconscious sense of it being time for a change. But the alternative way of thinking is that the opposition, the NDP, who seem to be the other front runners, they've never formed a government before, so there may be a kind of unconscious mistrust. To be honest, I wouldn't put very much faith in either of those. So we have the polls. We have some not very good reasons to think that the polls might be biased, and the polls are getting me no further than 50-50. So I'm going with 50% on this one.
Wow, so that's a pretty even-handed forecast you've got there, Nick. I actually am not going to be too much more adventurous than you, but I'm actually edging a little bit higher in favor of Stephen Harper retaining his political incumbency. I'm going to start it at 55%. And we're lucky this week because we actually are having a Canadian guest on our show this week, Dan Gardner, who is the co-author of Superforecasting, the Art and Science of Prediction, with Phil Tetlock. Phil Tetlock, with whom you and I have worked on the Good Judgment Project, and for whom we have been the Superforecasting guinea pigs. We're very lucky to have Dan as a guest today, and he's going to give us his opinion on the election from the Canadian perspective.
Right.
If the question is, will Stephen Harper vacate the office of Prime Minister, you have to do a lot of antecedent questions, answer a lot of antecedent questions first. And those antecedent questions, such as who's going to actually win the election and to what extent will they win the election, are incredibly difficult. And that's before you even get to that question of whether he's going to leave office. So if you look at Canadian elections generally, there's always a liberal versus conservative dynamic, and then there's this third party, the New Democratic Party. And that very fact that there's always a strong third party makes Canadian elections inherently more difficult to predict than U.S. presidential elections. Just that factor alone. Well, something has changed in this election. For the first time, that third party, the New Democratic Party, is actually challenging. They're actually leading in the polls by a very, very tiny amount. We've basically got a dead heat between three parties. You've got 31, 30, 29% dividing the parties. Now that obviously is a big, big challenge at that point to predict under any system, but it's particularly difficult under the Canadian electoral system because the way our system works is the whole country is divided into local ridings, electoral districts. And when you go to vote, you don't vote for the Prime Minister, you vote for your individual member of Parliament. And then whoever gets the most votes in the local riding gets sent off to Parliament. Whoever commands the respect of Parliament gets to become Prime Minister and form government. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that when you have this dead heat between these three parties, you're going to have in riding after riding after riding, the margin of victory between the winner and the loser could be incredibly tiny. It could be somebody with 32% of the vote declared the victor. And so what that means is little tiny shifts in riding after riding can change the outcome of each one of those decisions. And then cumulatively, those little tiny shifts together can change the outcome in the Parliament. This is an incredibly difficult election to forecast. Step one. Step two, will Stephen Harper vacate the office of Prime Minister isn't necessarily determined by step one. Because under our system, Stephen Harper today, even after the election is called, remains Prime Minister. And if we get an outcome in which you have a very split, very divided Parliament, in which no party controls the majority of seats, no party even comes close to controlling the majority, he still enters the House of Commons as the Prime Minister, and he can try and form government in any number of ways, including with coalitions with opposition parties and so on. Again, that aspect alone, even if you set aside the election, is incredibly difficult to forecast. You put those two things together, and I'm not going to bet a cent on my forecast on this election.
Thanks so much, Dan, for your thoughts and views. We're going to be looking forward to tracking this election. And for those of you who are interested in submitting your ideas for questions for us to forecast on, we urge you to check into our Twitter feed, which is at super_powered, or check in with our Facebook feed at superpowered, and send us your ideas, thoughts, and comments, and we'd love to have them on the show. So that's all for me this week. Anything else from you, Nick?
Okay.
All right, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.